So, hello everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Chris Holguin. I'm an associate director in the Office of Student Involvement. And today's session is part of a series that Student Affairs has been putting on throughout the summer. We're trying to focus on leadership development and being able to provide opportunities for students to still develop those skills that they would be if they were on campus. So I just want to thank Father Muccino for again, being able to participate in another session and then really leading the session as great as he did the last session as well. So with that said, I'll just turn it over to Father right now.
Okay, thanks a lot, Chris, and welcome everyone. I'd like to begin with first a disclaimer. This is going to be about dynamic teams and effective leaders. But I am so mindful that we are living in a world right now where we have to kind of put parentheses around any topic and allow for a description to be inclusive of the effects of living in a pandemic world. And I think that's appropriate to our understanding of leadership and teamwork. What does it mean to be a dynamic team when virtual interactions are normative? How is one a good leader? You'll see some of the attributes of a good team. How do you pull that off in virtual space? How do you overcome the barriers that distancing and spacing are going to put? So I really, I see a challenge in that, but maybe all the more if we're going to come up with creative ways to be about teamwork and leadership in our current world. We've got to be grounded in what good teamwork and leadership means in any setting, and then take that and move it forward to be able to translate it to the COVID world. So I'd like to begin by just having one of you volunteer for the group. So we won't throw anything under the bus. So rather, I was going to say, someone described to me a bad team you were on. But why don't we start with a good team? Sumner, tell me a good team you were on. Describe, and it could be anything from athletics to business, research lab, a classroom. Just thumbnail a good team that you were on for us, if you could.
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind for me is last summer running a summer camp. So there were 6 of us on that team. 5 of us worked really well together. And yeah, we talked about things that we thought needed to change, and we really adapted to all of those things pretty much daily. And if someone was having a hard time, someone else would pick up the slack. And yeah, so just being there, being open about things and honest about things was really good.
Okay, so candor and transparency and good communication. So let me press you then, not for the sake of throwing anything under the bus, but looking what made moments of that team a bad team?
When people weren't willing to do the work that they were supposed to be doing. When we wouldn't really share certain things that needed to be said in order to have us all really work together appropriately.
So when you say share things, is it safe to boil that down to communication also, that communication was lagging?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so you said when people weren't carrying their load or doing their responsibility, their role or their task, when for whatever reason, maybe there wasn't good communication, and maybe part of the communication was whose responsibility is it to call people to accountability. And so tell me more, what else about those 6 people made it a good team?
We were all friends with one particular person beforehand, and I think because of that, we kind of found that our personalities really worked well together.
So you had a shared identity and a little bit of shared history?
Yeah. And also just like being willing to get comfortable with each other and spend that time with each other and really feel like we could all be friends as well and be honest, if that makes sense.
Okay, so let me expand the topic. So we're talking about teamwork and leadership. So using your example, What I didn't hear in the last 30 seconds was the word leader from you. So which is interesting, and we'll come back to that as we talk about teamwork and leadership, because I think at your generation, at your level of credentialing yourself, moving into the professional world, you all see yourselves as equals and not hierarchically arranged. So notion of a leader doesn't always get play. But if you had said you were on a good soccer team, well, I hope you would have talked about your captain or your coach. Or if you worked as a wait staff in a restaurant when we still had restaurants that serve food, you would talk about your boss or the person who was in charge, that they had some effect on making you a good team. Okay, all right, thank you for that piece. So I'm going to go to the module now and we'll start walking through it. Okay, so like I'm saying, we're going to talk about what makes for dynamic teams that you want to be on, teams that get the work and the chores done, and what makes for an effective leader, because those two have to go hand in hand. And let me just set the stage here. So we're realizing that more and more of processes in our world, and for that matter, human behaviors in education, research, business, Starbucks runs teams, healthcare delivery is becoming a team-delivered model. They're becoming increasingly interdisciplinary. It's not just physician and patient. They're becoming interprofessional with pharmacists and social workers and IT people that are team-based. So flipping that around, the reverse of that, there is evidence that shows when you do root cause analysis of problems in the world that many of the bad outcomes in healthcare, in athletics, in governments are a result of system failures, poor teamwork, poor collaboration, or bad leadership. So I think that there's a lot of evidence to say that we need to get real and get on top of teamwork and leadership. So we want to spend this time now talking what makes for a successful team, and also as you move into your professional futures, what will make you an effective leader, okay? And I put in here, for the sake of the module, the kind of frame of reference I'm going to use for this would have you think about, okay, so why should this be important, or can this be important for you? Put it in the framework of how you would explain to someone interviewing you for a job, for a professional school program, if they asked you what makes a good team and what makes a good leader. So I hope by the end of this module that we will have talked in a way that allows you to articulate those two things, okay? So we're gonna move forward. First, a simple, if you thought in your mind before I show it, if I were to ask you to take out a piece of paper and write, what is a team? What would you put down? Well, Sumner, you began by saying 5 out of the 6 people knew one another, got along well. So we were teammates. We were a good team. So we didn't press you on the 6th person out. And we all wonder about that. And we do need to do a root cause analysis without throwing anyone under the bus. But what made you a team? So let's look at a definition here. So it's 2 or more people who, as we said, what makes for dynamic teams. So 2 or more people who in some way are interacting, relating dynamically, interdependently, not independently. And that's where virtual reality is a little scary, because, or sheltering home alone is a little scary, because we become fairly independent rather than interdependent. And I like the word adaptive, because no team is perfect. No government is perfect. No church is perfect. No college or university is perfect. We've got to be adaptive. In what way? Towards our mission statement, our shared valued goals, and the functions we've been assigned to do. And also the team has a time limited or project limited participation. So you may have really liked the field hockey team you're on, but once you graduate, you're not on that team anymore. It had a time limited lifespan for it, and that's okay. The way I like to look at that is not so much what happens to your best friends when your D1 basketball team breaks up and graduates, so much as looking forward to who is going to be your next team, who will be that next cohort of people who are going to rely on you to interact interdependently with them, sharing common projects and goals for however much time you're on that team. So we want to think going forward about the teams we will be on, so that as we come into those teams, we come in with a good awareness of what makes a good team, what makes a good leader, and how we would hold our team to accountability, whether or not it's a good team or a bad team, like we just did with Sumner. Okay, so what makes for a successful team? What's, you're in your team, so what's going to make this a good team or bad team? So Sumner already talked to us a little bit about some attributes of a team that seemed to make it successful for her. The shared history and knowledge of one another. What was a negative when people weren't pulling their weight? So let's explore that by setting out some expectations for a good team. And you could see here, number one is leadership. That's why it jumped out to me that as Sumner reported on her team, and she seemed to be in favor of it, I held her to downs to say, where was the L word? Where was leadership? But then I gave you a little bit of an explanation why that doesn't leap out. Because at this stage in your career, while you may have been asked at Holy Cross to be an SGA leader, to be a head RA, to be head of a dance troupe or a South Asian group, and you took some leadership of a sorority, many schools have. You have had some leadership, but I would argue the world isn't looking to you right now to necessarily be a leader. Why? Because you still have to grow into that role and that responsibility with the defined project and ownership of that. So leadership, we're going to come back to when we do the section on leadership. It's key, but we want to make it fair to you and how you need to understand leadership from your developmental stage in your career. Sumner mentioned communication. When it goes bad and not people aren't held to downs, or when it's good because it's transparent, vulnerable, honest, and we're going to talk more about communication. Another important piece which Sumner alluded to was situational awareness. When someone either isn't aware that they're not pulling their weight, or the rest of the team, either because we're so isolated and only meeting virtually that we don't see the bigger picture, we don't have a grasp of the whole situation. Or one could raise the question, in virtual reality, how do we cross-monitor one another when I can't even see all of your faces because you're hidden behind your screens right now? You see what I'm saying? This is throwing a wrinkle into our ability to monitor, to be aware, to feel connected of what's going on. And finally, mutual support. And Sumner, you alluded to that a little bit by saying when someone's not pulling their weight, not only are they not supporting the team, they're dragging the team down, because people who have assigned roles, responsibilities now have to pick up the burden unless you can communicate through a good leader how to bring that person back into the fold. And we'll see how to do that as we go ahead. So these are the pillars of a good team. So if someone asks you to write for a job interview or at a job interview or write on an application, talk to me about a good team, you have some talking points now for what makes for a good team. You could simply say, there are many different types of team, but I would think at the bare minimum, a good team should be well led by someone who knows what their role and responsibilities are, that communication, not only from the leader to the team, but within the team is strong, and we'll talk about what makes it strong. That like any good team, if you're on a soccer team and one of your teammates is just getting annihilated by the player that's on them, you're going to call a timeout and figure out a strategy that can help you support them so that you balance out the weaknesses in a team. So you should be able to talk to these 4 pillars of a high-performing team. Any questions on that before I take the next step? Does that make sense, gang? Okay. So let's start with the first pillar for a second. So the question becomes, why have a leader? And that's why, I worked 15 years in a medical school, 10 of those years teaching team dynamics and testing teams on how to perform. One of the measurements we had for them is to see how well or not well a team established a leader. And it was one of the weak links. And as we debriefed them and said, why was there no leader? Well, everyone would look at everyone else and say, well, I'm not the boss. I'm not any better than them. I'm not any more credentialed to them. Who would we decide is going to be the leader? Okay, I get that. I understand that developmentally and structurally. But for the sake of our discussion here, we need to know that a leader is critical. And I just prefaced that. But let's first say, one thing we can get on the table is being a leader is not about power or control or who has all the credentials. Some of the best teams. I was chair of a committee at one point, and I was really proud of that committee. And I actually was satisfied with how it went. And part of what made me satisfied is every time I went to a meeting, I went to that meeting to lead it, knowing I was not the smartest person in the room by a long shot. But I believe that my role as a leader was to take all that talent and make it work together as a team. So you don't have to be the head poobah and all the skills, knowledge, and you have to know what a leader should be doing for and with the team, and then you can become a good leader. So it's not about power or control or who's most credentialed. And it's not about ego, okay? So what then is the purpose of a leader? So the purpose of a leader is to fulfill roles. So why have a leader? Well, the leader has some roles and responsibilities. Someone has to set the project or goal. So if you were the leader of some club at school and you had a meeting, the good leader is going to say, so what projects or goals or do we plan for the year? What fundraisers? Someone's got to clarify and define where you're going. And the language we use for that, someone has to establish a shared mental model among all the team members. We call it getting everyone on a level playing field or everyone on the same page. So in simple language, if someone said to you, what makes a good leader? So you could say it's not the brightest, it's not necessarily the most credentialed, but someone who has the ability to get people on the same page. And we'll talk about how and why you do that. Someone who's willing to take responsibility for being the person to manage resources, including people, the team members, and be able to assign roles and responsibility with people in a way that works. As Sumner was saying, what makes for a good team is a leader who communicates well, who's able to share information openly and honestly. And we'll come back to this when we talk about what makes for good communication. Getting a little more nuanced about this, a good leader is someone who has the ability, who gets along with people well enough to give feedback, both constructive and supportive feedback. So are you able to be someone to say, Sumner, this isn't about who wins and who loses. For your sake, I need to talk about your strengths, and let's then talk about what can make you better or what's not playing well. And that takes a skill, and we'll talk about that also as we go on. Someone who's a person who has a personality to encourage people, to make them their best person, to support people in their roles. As I said above here, providing the feedback is a leader's responsibility to review and monitor the team's performance. So that's why a good leader shouldn't get down too far in the weeds. They should have a bit of the 10,000-foot view to see how the team is doing. That's why you have a coach or on the sidelines, so they can see how the game is going. Very sticky one, and we'll take a moment to talk about this. A good leader is someone who knows it's their job to facilitate conflict resolution. Okay, so are you going to be someone who creates divisiveness and cliques and divisions among people, or are you someone who can bring people together? What's the saying? We're better when we're stronger together. And to solicit feedback on their own performance. So it isn't enough for me just to say to a team member, you know, I think this can make you better. You then have to say, all right, gang, before we're done, I want to give you 15 or 20 minutes for you all to tell me what I could be doing better, and my being willing to take constructive criticism for the sake of the team. It's all about the team. It's not about egos. It's not about win-win or win-lose, okay? So one little nuance to help you picture different types of leaders are two. There's the designated leader. So in an institution, a school, you're always going to have a CEO, a vice president, a dean, a manager, you know, the head chef in the restaurant. So we're used to designated leaders, and they're the people who lead the team, like we said, who establish the goals, facilitate the communication, and make sure the members are clicking together. And that's designated leadership. And right now, most of you are not in designated leaderships unless your school, your group, or your whatever your team made you a captain or a leader. So maybe you have been designated leaders in part of your roles. But you also need to remember that leadership is rather fluid and situational. So any member of the team who at a given moment under certain demands has the skills, the personality, the ability, and the willingness in that moment to formally manage that situation as the leader, to take charge as circumstances dictate. So let me give you a medical example. In the hospital, we tend to think of the leader of a healthcare team as, in an older model, always the physician. Well, as we become more interprofessional, it could be the nurse, it could be the anesthesiologist, it could be the respiratory therapist if it's a patient with COVID who's needing respirator management. Or let me give another example. When patients are no longer able to be cured, and think about it in all our hospitals right now, when someone has been determined that they're not going to survive their COVID, well, it may go from being the respiratory therapist and physicians and nurses who are in charge or leaders to the chaplain being leader of the team as they meet with the family and work with them as they do what's called terminal withdrawal from a ventilator. So in that moment, when you're saying we're going to withdraw care, the physician is not the leader. The person emotionally supporting the family, the chaplain, the social worker, the palliative care, the hospice worker, they become the situational leaders. So we want a certain fluidity and agility of mind to be able to think, or you to ask yourself, in what situations could I be called to be a leader? Okay. All right, so what are the roles that good leaders carry out? And we've already mentioned these, but I just want to bullet them to keep reinforcing them in your mind. Or if you're asked in an interview and someone says, all right, give me the 5 roles of a good leader. Well, someone who manages resources. So, you know, baseball players or soccer players, it's not their job to be the coach or to be the general manager or to be the recruiting, person. You need someone who has to have the overview and the willingness to manage many resources. So you need someone at the top. We already said someone who could facilitate good communication, someone who's willing to make adjustments in team performance. So why are timeouts so important? Why is halftime an important thing at a soccer match or a basketball game? Because the leader can then say, okay, all of you are really working hard, but I have the 10,000-foot view, and I see what's not working out there. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to shift directions, and we're going to switch from zone defense to man-to-man defense, or vice versa. So you want to monitor and be able to adjust and recalibrate the team to reach their goal. And we said the hard part is being a leader who can resolve conflict. Okay, so these are the critical roles of the leaders. But the good news is that we have some tools for the leader that can help them in being a leader. So I've already mentioned some. So if responsibility is a requirement and a role of a leader, managing resources, then what would be a tool? Well, timeouts. Briefs are what are called are timeouts. So you call a timeout, or before you even begin what you're doing. So if I'm in the hospital and we're going to do a cardioversion of a patient in an irregular heart rhythm, and I have a respiratory therapist, a nurse, and another physician there with me, we don't just walk in the room and start charging the paddles. We walk in and I say, before we begin, before we go in the room, let's talk about what our goal is. To the team member, to the nurse, I want you to check the vital signs, make sure the IV that we're going to give the sedation is working. The respiratory therapist, I want you to make sure we have oxygen on the patient. To my cardiology colleague, you're going to man the defibrillator, and we're going to go into the room. We're going to check the blood pressure. If the vitals are stable, we will administer the twilight sedation, and then you will charge the paddles. We will do a cardioversion, and then I want you to recheck the vital signs every 5 minutes afterwards. So we've got the game plan. The brief is to set the agenda, to set the shared mental model of what's your goal and the steps in the process. That's a critical tool that a good leader has to make sure that the team knows what they're going to do. Okay? Managing performance. So how is the team doing? So say we're doing a longer thing, like how do you manage triaging in an emergency department? You might take a timeout and say, you know, we're running out of rooms here. We've got to open another wing of an unused part of the building to move patients in. So huddles or timeouts or debriefs help someone to manage performance. Those are important tools. So if someone were to ask you, what did you do as a leader when you were in a crisis? You know, Sumner, you were talking about your team. You know, before we left a meeting, we made sure that we debriefed to say, does everyone know their role and responsibility? Anyone here who can't do it in a timely fashion? So someone may say, you know, I'm all on with this, but I can't get to this for 2 weeks. Thank you for telling me as the leader. I need it done in a week. So why don't you switch with someone else who can do this within a week, and you do the other job, which you can do in 2 weeks. So to be able to brief, debrief, and manage performance. Other tools are facilitating communication, and we're going to do a full thing on communication in a minute, but you want to say a good leader, as Sumner said, you need to communicate well. And then we said the stickler, the tricky one, resolving conflict. And we're going to come back to this also. There's 2 types of conflict, situational and interpersonal. So we've all had our interpersonal experiences. It's the team member you don't get along with, that you can't get on the same page with. But there's other conflict where you may have competing views of the right thing to do. That's conflict also. That's why our government doesn't, the Senate and the Congress don't work, because Republicans and Democrats don't have a shared mental model of how to resolve a decision. Okay, so interpersonal, and we'll talk about how to solve that. So we said these are the critical roles of a leader. Someone who manages well, communicates well, makes mid-course adjustments, and has the courage and the skills to diplomatically resolve conflict in the team so the team can move forward. It's old news now, but years ago, I'm a big Yankee fan. When the Yankees got A-Rod on their team, and A-Rod was all about A-Rod, the team was not doing well. They were risking going down the tubes. So the team had to come together and say, look, how do we fix this? So they had to take steps and say to A-Rod, we value you as a team member, but if it's all about you, it's not going to work. So here's our suggestion. No media interviews with you. You're only at practice and at games. You're giving us your best. Do you get it? Do you agree that that would be a good thing to do? And during that year, when A-Rod could have just ripped the team apart, they were a good team because they were able to resolve that conflict with candid strategies and solutions and being honest with one another. Okay, so we've already said briefs and huddles. So here's me in my room with a team that we're gonna cardiovert a patient, and the leader of the team is telling the rest of the team what their roles and responsibilities are. That's called a brief. Or if you go into Starbucks on a given day and you're the head person, and okay, where are we? Team member raised their hand. 2 people called in sick. Okay, Joe, you're going to take over cash register. Bill, you're going to do this. You're going to man the desk. Supplies. Who's going to do the hot foods? Who's going to do the coffees? So you get your pre-game game plan, assigning roles and responsibility, clarifying the game plan, and getting everyone on a shared mental model. Okay, so a brief is an important thing. We already said huddles, timeouts. So in the middle of the game, you see, when the Holy Cross women's team come out, and if after the first 2 minutes of the game, they're down 20-0, the coach better call a timeout and say, okay, our game plan isn't working. They came out with a different strength. Let's readjust. So huddling or timeouts. Even chaplains do that. Midday, all the chaplains in the hospital will come together and say, where are we? Well, we've got some real sick people up in the ICU, so we're not going to be able to do first visits to newbies. We're going to have to go deal with crises in the ICU. So you adjust and modify your plan. You address critical issues and emerging events. You anticipate challenges, creating contingency plans, and you reassign or align resources to make the team stronger. And through it all, you listen and communicate, allowing people, as Sumner said, to speak their concerns. Because if people are holding back, and let me be honest with you, in healthcare, I worked with nurses and physicians building teamwork, and my colleague was one of the heads of the nursing school. So together we took teams of nurses and physicians and made them team members. When we would observe them, we would come in and debrief them, and she would turn to the nurses and said, you saw something that you didn't agree with. Why didn't you speak up? And they would say, I'm not the doctor. And she looked and said, that is hogwash. It's about patient safety. It's your responsibility to speak up. You could be the leader of the team. Would you want them not to speak up to you? So you see, this is serious stuff, expressing concerns. There's no one when it comes to the project and the goal for your team to ever say, not my job, not my responsibility. Debriefing has become really critical in our world. Whenever we do something, we all go home after a major event and we never talk about what happened, what went right, what went wrong, what we can do better tomorrow. Even in healthcare, that is a lack. A code takes place. You take care of a sick patient. Maybe they make it, maybe they don't. What happens once the patient is gone, either because they made it and they're in the ICU, or they die and they're down in the morgue, we just go home by ourselves and feel bad about it. We've got to debrief what went well, what went better. Teams that debrief are much more effective. So if someone says what makes for a good team and what's a good tool that a leader has, that before you step away from the event, you look back on it and mine it, okay? And this is a little checklist that was created for debriefing. So we go around the room. What do we think, gang? How was our communication? Did everyone know their roles and responsibility? Were we carrying them out? Someone might say, I didn't feel comfortable in my job because I'm not that good starting an IV. I'd rather not be doing the hot food. I'd rather be doing the takeout or whatever. Were we aware of what the other team members were doing? Were we situationally mindful? How was our workload distribution? Did we speak up and ask for assistance? What errors can we avoid? And what went well? What should we change? What can we improve? So debriefs are an important thing, and worth mentioning, because many people do not, just like leadership, we don't consider debriefing important because we all want to get home. Like I said, facilitating communication, and we'll come back to those in the next section. We talked about resolving conflict, both interpersonal and situational. So situational is when something's happening on the team, when someone recognizes something's not going well and are not appropriate, or we're having an argument between should we be doing it this way or that way, we have to express our voice. So there's a model that's called cuss. So we all think in that situation, it said you should use cuss words if you see something's wrong. And cuss means, you know, Sumner, I'm concerned about what's going on here. And I don't feel comfortable because I think the way we're operating is not going to get us to our goal. See, that's what we're meant to speak out about. So concerns should be communicated to the leader and the team using concerned, uncomfortable, and I don't think this is safe if we're meeting our goal. And that can require challenging authority, like I just said. The nurse who says, well, I can't say anything, it's the doctor's job to know it. So an example of video I have, a physician is saying, a nurse says, I'm uncomfortable about this pregnant patient. The fetal heart tones are slowing down a little. And the doctor comes in and says, well, it's still early, let's give another half an hour. And the nurse says, no, we've been going now for an hour and they're getting worse. I'm uncomfortable with this. I think this is a patient safety issue. And then makes a suggestion, I think we ought to mobilize the C-section team to be ready to go for a stat C-section. So it's everyone's responsibility when it's about safety or reaching our goal to challenge the prevailing paradigm, okay? And then resolving interpersonal conflict. So we're all mindful that no team is a perfect team, even with A-Rod on it, but you can be a better team if you take good steps to resolve the conflict. And there's a method for resolving it, and it's called the desk script. D stands for describe what happened. So what you do is if you're not clicking with a team member, you have a problem, you take a timeout, you maybe wait till cooler heads prevail, and then you ask your team member or the leader, ask the leader to meet with them. And with cool heads, you sit down and you begin by describing what happened. Bill, you know, yesterday when you came in and I was starting an IV on that patient, you came up to me and said, why aren't you taking care of my patient? Aren't I important? You didn't realize that this patient was sicker. You express how you felt. Speaking to me that way in front of the patient undermined my credibility. Then you suggest an alternative plan. If you would next time ask me to step out of the room away from the patient and share your concern, then I could fill you in to explain that your patients are important to me, but you need to be aware, which you weren't, that this was a sicker patient and that I will take care of yours when I'm done. So creating a constructive alternative plan. And if your team member tends to be bullheaded and said, no way, then you firmly but politely say, if that's the way you feel, then perhaps we ought to bring this up to the supervisor of the unit to get their view. Or we go to the general manager or the coach to say, are we going to play man-to-man defense or zone? You see, so it's describe in an objective way what you observed. It neutralizes, because facts is facts. Even the most stubborn person can't argue with the facts. Then you have the right to express how it made you feel as a team member. And then you constructively suggest, and hopefully at that point you will agree on that suggestion, but you have a backup. If they say no, you don't throw them under a bus and say, well, then let's bring in someone who can arbitrate this, because we are a team. And the goal of that is to restore team unity, team energy, team effectiveness. Okay, so you could now, if someone asked you, say you have learned a methodology for doing one of the hardest things in human relationships, resolving interpersonal conflict with an organized methodology to it. Okay, communication. We've already talked a lot about it. So what makes for good communication? We've got the cartoon here. You need to make better your method of talking. Do you mean I need to improve my communication skills? Yeah. So we all need to have better forms of communication. So what are the virtues? So if you in your job interview, someone says, okay, talk to me about this important thing called communication. What makes for good communication? Well, I try and keep it simple. I want my communication to be complete, concise, clear, and timely. Complete meaning I'm aware of what everyone needs to know, but I'm also aware that we're often under a time crunch. So I make my communications concise, and I always try and make it as clear. I get rid of jargon. I make it understandable to every team member. And I need to tell them when they need to know. I can't wait till it's already become so big a problem that we can't fix this. So we want communication to be complete, concise, clear, and timely. Okay, so what are some tools and skills for making some good communication good? So I like to think of Starbucks as a pedestrian example. And it's an example of what Team Steps, which is a team dynamic, calls checkbacks. What is a checkback? It's a method of closing the loop on communication. So what's a simple explanation? You go into Starbucks, I go into Starbucks, and I order a venti decaf caramel skim latte low foam. Now that's a lot to remember. I've communicated a lot to that person. And I have, I could just trust, or they could just trust their memory, but you don't want the wrong drink to end up at the end of the counter, do you? So what do? They check back with you. They say, okay, I heard venti decaf caramel skim latte low foam. And I say, right. And then they go a step further and say, sir, did you want that hot or cold? Because they know that I forgot to tell them something that's going to make a difference in whether we get the right drink. So communication has to be complete, concise, clear, timely, but you also can help it by then using closed loop. So when we train people, we tend to train them on teams to be like a Starbucks person. So if I'm working with a sick patient and I want to order a medication, I might say to the nurse or the respiratory therapist, I'd like you to give a nebulized treatment with albuterol over 15 minutes. If they just walk away and give it, do I know what they just did? Well, maybe if I know them, like Sumner knew the people with them, because we had a history together. What if I'm working with a team member I don't know? So what do I want that person who I just gave a request to do to me? To say a albuterol nebulizer over 15 minutes. So then I know that they know what they're about to do. So what if I were to say with a heart attack patient who we often give morphine to help with their pain, or we may want to give a fluid pill called Lasix. Both of them have dosages. So what if I come in and I'm thinking, all right, they've got a heart attack, and they're in a little bit of congestive heart failure. Okay, to the nurse, I'd like you to give 40 milligrams of morphine IV push for the patient. If the nurse just says 40 milligrams, I've never given that, but they're the doctor. They draw up 40 milligrams of morphine and push it in, and the patient stops breathing and dies. What I want a team member to do is say, doctor, in the heat of this, did you get the right medicine and the right dose? I've never given 40 milligrams of morphine. Did I say morphine? I wanted you to give 40 milligrams of furosemide, which is the standard dose to treat congestive heart failure. I got them confused. Thank you for bringing that back up and closing the loop. Like the barista at Starbucks, did you want skim or whole milk? Did you really want morphine? So closing the loop, we've all got to become a little bit like a Starbucks closed loop person because it's about safety. Okay, so enough with that. Another simple one is call outs. And where in our culture can we not benefit from that? So in a hospital, I want someone on my team to say, uh-oh, we're managing a sick patient. I just noticed that their IV fell out. We've got to start another one. If no one calls that out, we don't restart it. We can't give the meds. Or can the police call out and say, you can't be doing that to this patient. He's not breathing. What makes a good police team? Are they willing to call out what's right and what should be done? And then we'll come to SBAR in a minute. That's being used more and more. So we said checkbacks, closed loop. I'd like a large decaf caramel latte. One large, did you want that hot or cold? I've talked about the morphine. Call outs are when we speak up, just a simple tactic to let someone know that there's a problem. The patient's blood pressure is going lower if you're the person assigned to check it, okay? And anyone, it isn't just the leader that needs to do that. So we all have to be willing to call out when we don't think something is right. I'm concerned, this is unsafe. We're not gonna reach our goal. Okay, so it range, they've switched from man to zone. Okay, the team knows it. We're gonna change. We need another cashier at the checkout lines in the grocery store. The computer is down. What are we gonna do in the meantime? Okay, finally, SBAR. SBAR is a structured communication system for relaying information that's very medically driven, but it can be used for anything. We did it in our office whenever we had a team meeting. So if I were leading my committee, I would come in and say, okay, today our topic is, and I named the situation, we're gonna address third-year evaluations. So what's the background? We're here today because we have found that reports have shown that our assessments of students have become too subjective and they're not standardized enough. Okay, so my assessment is we need a new tool. So I am recommending today that we set out a plan to suggest some new assessments for the situation. Or in a crisis situation, you're in the emergency room and you've got a trauma patient and you call anesthesia. We just got a code in. It's a 30-year-old from a motorcycle accident who's bleeding from the ears and the mouth. I'd like you to come in and intubate the patient. So we think he could have a spinal fracture and a basilar skull fracture. I'd like you to come in and stabilize the patient and intubate them. So situation, brief background, your assessment of what you think is going on, and a concise recommendation of what you want someone else to do. So think about it in an airplane. Your co-pilot is with you. You know, the GPS doesn't seem to be working properly on our flight, and we're in the clouds and we can't, visibility is limited. So what's the background? We know that we're heading across the Sierra Mountains. So what's your assessment? I think in light of not having a GPS, we need to attain higher altitude to assure safe clearance. What's your recommendation? Let's go up 2,000 feet higher. So SBAR, okay? Situation, what's our background? What's our assessment? Where are we going? How about team matter? The deadline, so Sumner, for your team, the deadline for our project has been moved up by a week. That's the situation. What's the background? Most of us are done, but we've got one team member working on getting theirs done. What's the assessment? We're gonna need to adjust here. We need to help everyone we need to upload to make the new deadline. So what's the recommendation? Let's shift assignments and have Jessica assist him to make sure everything is done on time. So SBAR. So that's one schema. So if someone were again to ask you, what makes for good leadership and communication, that I'm used to communicating with people that gives them a little bit of frame of reference about what the situation, the background, the assessment, and where we're going is, so that everyone can be on the same level playing field. So let's see if I have the video here. Yeah, so let me just show this for a minute. So this is situational awareness. So let's just go into this for a minute. We said a good team is a team whose leader gets the team on the same page. So these are four penguins, and what's their goal? To find a fish, because they're all hungry. Okay, so they have a shared mental model that they're focusing on the fish. So you want that. You got to know what your goal is, so they're not waddling around not knowing what to do. So they understand the goal, how they're going to do it, and whose role and tasks. Okay, so what happens if you don't have that? This is what it looks like.
So when you talk about team situational awareness, we're talking about the players on the team in their mind having what's called a shared mental model.
Can you all hear it?
Why a football team, other than Peyton Manning's, huddle and talk about what they're going to do when the ball is snapped. So all 11 players have that shared mental model when they snap the football. I'm going to show you a video. It's going to have two gentlemen, and I want you to tell me if you feel they're sharing the same mental model.
So he sees the guy stretching, but he doesn't see it that way. Okay, so they didn't have a shared mental model. The runner was stretching, and the guy thinks he wants to push his car over the cliff. So if you don't have a shared mental model, your best laid plans are going to go over the cliff. So that's a funny, dramatic way of saying before you undertake something, the team has to have that shared mental model. That's why a brief is important. That's why a huddle, if you don't get it, is important, so things don't go over the cliff. Okay. So you want to have that shared mental model, and teams must always continue to monitor what's going on. So here's a little eponym. So you might say, well, what are we monitoring? So again, this is a way to, a mnemonic to think about it. You monitor STEP, your stakeholder. Is it your Starbucks customer? Is it your business client? Is it your patient in the hospital? Is it the vehicle that got pushed over the cliff? You want to be able to say, who's the stakeholder, and keep that in mind. You want to also, you want to keep looking at your patient to say, if everyone's doing their task and no one realizes the patient just stopped breathing, then you've got a problem, okay? You also want to monitor the team to see how they're doing. Do we have enough people? Do we have enough protective gear for the team? You want to look at the environment. What's going on? Do we have too many people here that we need to get rid of? Should we get more gowns and masks, or someone's going to get infected? So stakeholder, team, environment, and then progress to the goal. Are we on track? So if I have a sick patient and I call and the patient stops breathing, I say, all right, I can intubate the patient. I can put a tube in them. So I step to the head and I'm trying, and the nurses say, you know, this is taking too long. And I say to them, I've never missed one of these. I'll get it. And the nurse doesn't say to me, it's been 4 minutes. You can't hold your breath that long. We need to call anesthesiology. So you've got to track, are you progressing in a timely fashion? Stakeholder, team, environment, and progress towards your goal. So that's situational awareness. So what are we situationally aware about so that we can provide proper support to the team? So if your team, someone's not pulling their weight, how do we work with that so that we support one another? First, you got to communicate with them and say, is there a problem? Because we need this by tomorrow. It doesn't look like you're going to get there. Talk to us. Do you think you can get it done tonight? Or do we need to make an adjustment? So how do we support one another? By offering assistance to someone, by communicating and providing feedback. We don't have 2 weeks. We've got to get it done tonight. And by resolving conflict in the ways we just talked about. Okay, so let's move ahead to wrap up here. Okay, we've done all of these. Good. So putting it all together. So now having seen what the pillars of teamwork are, so now you should be able to, if asked the question, what makes a good team or team member? What do you know about good leadership? How do you promote good communication? And how do you make a team stronger? You should now be at least somewhat mindful that a good team has these 4 pillars: leaders, a good leader, communication, a situationally monitoring team members who can mutually support one another, that a good teams always have a clear shared mental model that usually is made clear by a leader. Every team needs a leader. So don't fall into the trap of saying we can just do a group hug of everyone being equal. It's not about hierarchy, ego. It's about someone who has a willingness to take on the roles and responsibility. It's not about the smartest person in the room. It's the person who's the right person at the right time to do the necessary thing. We said it's not about ego, but empowering a team and fulfilling the responsibility that a good leader is called to do. It's about good communication that's clear, timely, concise, complete, and confirmed through checkbacks. And you want to be an aware team, aware of who your stakeholder is, whether it's the patient or the customer or your client, that you're aware of how the team is performing, who are the weak links, and how can you strengthen them. What about your environment? How is that helping or hurting you? What's going on in the surroundings? And are you progressing the way the team should? Are you going to make it to the deadline in time? Are you able to speak confidently, not worried about repercussion, but making it all about safety and success? And does your team mutually support one another? So if a team does strive to put all of these into its place, using the tools we said, then hopefully it can become a more high-functioning and successful team, no matter where it is, a crew team, a hospital team, okay? And if you can grasp all of these and you can show that you understand what makes for a good teamwork and leadership, you will make yourself a more desirable applicant for a job or for a school. So if you're applying to a medical school or a residency program, and they ask you, what unique skill sets do you have? And you say to them, I have learned, and this is called Team Steps. It's a program for teamwork that was put together by the Army and Aeronautics, who realized they couldn't deal with bad outcomes. If a plane crashes, you can't fix that. If a battalion gets wiped out, you can't reverse that. So you need to go into it as a good team. So you could tell someone that you are interviewing with that you have learned the fundamentals of team dynamics. And if they say, oh yeah, well, tell me about that. Begin by saying, I've learned what makes for a good team, and name the 4 pillars. I now understand the importance of a leader and what their roles and responsibilities are. I'm aware that you have to have all team members situationally aware and mutually supportive of one another. So if you get that, then you have a skill set that very few people have, and that more and more institutions want as a skill set in their employees, their students, their physicians, and even at Starbucks, okay? So this is a valuable skill set that you can draw upon if you want to put in your resume to say, I have learned about good team dynamics. You're not just backing into it or muddling into it. You have the tools in reviewing this module to really speak to the critical, non-negotiable dynamics of good teamwork and good teams. And it also allows you to critique a team when it's not working well, and to understand when it is and what you want to build up and strengthen. It helps you to anticipate going in if you know that your team is weak in a certain area. Okay, we're starting work today. We realize that we didn't, with the staff we have, we weren't able to cover it yesterday. So I'm going to call in a few temporary nurses because we're overwhelmed in the ICU. or we're going to make sure respiratory therapy has enough ventilators to support us. We're going to anticipate what we need to do. So knowing how a good team needs to work helps you not to only avoid problems, but anticipate potential or future ones when you do it. Okay, so let's get out. Questions, comments, reactions. What sits, what fits, what are you still uncertain about?
I have to unfortunately get running to another meeting,
Okay,
but I wanted to say thank you because this was really, really helpful. And I definitely will be reviewing the module again to review all the different acronyms and stuff. But
yeah,
I think my favorite thing that I got out of it was the fact that a leader isn't necessarily the person that's the most skilled, but the person who's able to help everyone who is specifically skilled in a certain subject. Like,
yeah. And you know, you could think about that psychodynamically too. If I'm, you know, maybe I have a patient and I'm in the hospital and all of a sudden they call a code, you could argue and say, well, it's my patient, who knows them better than me? But you could also argue and say, are you too close to it?
mhm,
Should you have someone who realizes what the problem is and can
that is a really good point.
and be objective about it? So you're right in picking up on that nuance that the situational versus the designated is an important thing to remember. And think about what you're saying, because we live in a world right now where, you know, leadership and leaders, it's kind of a touchy subject. So to be able to speak in a positive, constructive way about the importance of that will help you to convince others that you take this seriously and responsibly.
Well, thank you so much.
You are
Have a
welcome.
great day.
Okay, you too. Any other questions, comments? What else touched you or surprised you or?
I'm just wondering, like how do you, in a situational leadership position, like how do you take on that role without coming across as like egotistical, and like how do you constructively do that?
Yeah, so it's the fine line between confidence and humility
Hmm.
with a small dose of courage.
Okay.
Because you know that a lot of team, you know, if no one's stepping up, you know, you've got people who are a little worried about doing it. So to be able to humbly and say, you know, I'm willing to do this, people will realize that you're not saying it's got to be me, it should be me, it has to be me. You're saying I'm willing, because it shows you're being sensitive to the fact that what's necessary here is someone to step into a role, not to dominate others. And you're also aware that in this instance, to be able to say, you know, I think I'd like to do this. Okay. And then you could say, anyone else have a problem or would like to do it? So you're open to communication right from the start. So you step forward with courage, confidence, and humility. You explain why I think I can give this a shot. And people will usually tell you, well, you can't, you don't have the skills to do that. If it's an egregious misfit, most of the time they're going to say, go for it. Because what people want is someone to turn to who is going to answer their questions, who they can bring information to, who they can call out problems with. You see?
Yes.
So it's a fine line between the two. So being both confident and humble in the same moment with a dose of courage. I'm willing to take responsibility, because then what you're telling the group that you are shouldering the burden of responsibility. But then you are then empowered to say, this is my responsibility, that I am going to have to assign you roles or reassign you as things go south or aren't working, to expect you to channel information back to me, and that we can do some correctives and no one's feelings get hurt.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you so much.
Good question. Are we good?
Thank you.
All right. I thank you for your attention. And feel free, as you review the module, or if down the road, you know, you're writing secondaries or anticipating interviews and you're a little fuzzy on something, just shoot me an email and we can talk about, you know, what it really means, so you're clear in your mind, so that your speaking points are solid and you know, good thoughts. Okay, I'm here whenever you need me. Okay,
Thank you. This is very helpful.
Chris, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
All right.
Awesome.
I think we did it.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And thank you, Father Muccino, for leading us on this great session. And I'm looking forward to, you know, continue working with you.
Okay, as am I.
Thank you, Father Muccino.
Bye, Sumner. Stay well and you do good things there. Teach